Carson, I wonder if you could help us understand the profound impact that cognitive hacking or reputational damage could have on businesses and other entities.
Sure, absolutely. PsyOps has been, a topic and a practice, a discipline for quite some time in military intelligence circles. So that's not new. On the more commercial side of the world, folks have probably heard the term pretexting, where there is an effort to convince someone, usually on a one-on-one basis, that you are someone you're not, and have an influence there. With the advent of social media, this creates an entirely new set of vehicles for this kind of tactic to be used en masse. So the ability to connect with many millions of consumers or voters, whatever it is that an adversary might be trying to target, and it's really quite simple. With a convincing enough story and enough background material that can be connected together, it is very, very simple and very inexpensive, frankly, to create, if not abject misunderstanding, certainly confusion. And the confusion can be just as bad as actual explicit misunderstanding. So, we've seen this with Twitter, being used to sort of create these waves of news. We've seen it, of course, with Facebook. There's quite a lot happening there. Really, any large social media infrastructure is capable of reaching a lot of people very quickly with very little filtering. And so, as the internet in general, there is no real filtering. There is no source of truth. We've seen some journalists lately. I'm sure you're very very on top of the recent journalistic wave of certain journalists coming out saying we need to sort of do away with fake news. The fact that there's very little filtering, there's very little fact checking happening, does enable this sort of thing to happen. So it's a very hard thing to balance between do you have a method or a process to try to determine what's true and not versus free speech. It becomes a very sticky situation very quickly. But social media, I would say, is the new tool that's available to organizations. Again, very cheap, very easy to fire away. It's really a matter of creating something controversial or interesting enough to essentially grab lots of eyeballs. And groupthink can come into play very quickly in that situation as well.
Carson, let's talk about IT and let's talk about governments, nonprofit organizations, every institution that relies on trust in order to do business. How do we prevent this? How do we stop both technical hacks and cognitive hacks?
The cognitive hack question is a much harder one, believe it or not. That's been the human factor in information security has been problematic for years and years. And it's very hard to address that. It's even more difficult when you start to think about individual opinions being modified and influenced. That's a very difficult thing to counter. From a technical perspective, the biggest challenges that we see enterprises trying to deal with, it's a combination of this adversarial threat landscape really becoming more complex, more intense. There's a lot more interest in the commercial infrastructure, the financial infrastructure, as targets for some of these adversaries. At the same time, there are just a drove of new technologies. Mobile is relatively old news, but there's still lots of new mobile apps being created for various things. You have cloud infrastructure, you have software as a service. There's just tons and tons of new technical vehicles that the security organizations have to address and secure. The other side of the coin there is it's very hard to find security talent today. There's a huge shortage of talent. It's well documented. We've done research studies on it here at CloudPassage. So even if organizations have the desire and the financial wherewithal to boost their skills and their teams in the cybersecurity space, it's very hard to find the people very simply to do that. So it really becomes an issue of far too much to do and far too much complexity with not enough skilled resources. Really, the answer to that question is automation in many cases. That's something we're seeing a lot more automation. There are trends in taking what's called a DevOps concept, applying it to security to make security move faster, make it more agile, more automated. So the prevention piece of security becomes something that's just there. There is a trend in security to focus on response. So that the challenge there is that sometimes financial and human resources get over-focused on responding to something and not really, trying to prevent in the first place. So that would be akin to never taking care of your health and just reacting anytime you got sick. It's obviously not something that makes a ton of sense. but it is a trend that, for whatever reason, has sort of evolved. So the idea of automation to get the prevention done so the human resources can focus on the more difficult problem of detecting slow moving threats, very customized threats that are not, broadly recognized by a lot of the capabilities we have today. These are really where the big brains need to be applied. The road day-to-day stuff should be automated. And from our perspective, that's really key and very critical. The other thing that we hope to see that we haven't seen is more information and technique sharing across organizations, both within industries and across industries. The best example of that I could point to is probably PCI. The credit card companies themselves, because of the fraud situation, it was financially driven in their case, decided to get together and do something about it. That's really much more effective than more regulation. So our hope is that industries that see this kind of situation as an issue for them, they recognize it's going to be a growing concern over time, start to share more knowledge, start to share more information to create a stronger overall industry posture.
Carson Sweet, CloudPassage. It's an incredibly important discussion and one that I hope we can continue. I wonder if you could briefly bring the election, walk us step by step. What types of cyber attacks can we anticipate in the next 6 to 8 months?
I think the most prominent cyber attack that I would predict, keep your eyes open for early signs of or reports in the news, would be attacks on individual states' voter rolls. That would be my probably most immediate guess. I think there are going to certainly be attacks that are going to be attempted on critical infrastructure. I think those are harder to execute. These environments tend to be, because they are, recognized as critical infrastructure nationally, they have access to, federal resources and federal support that maybe, state-based, database roles may not. So those are going to be more difficult. I think that the political end of this is going to be much more prominent. I think we also are going to see more fake news, to use the colloquialism, both in social media, and my belief is that we're going to start seeing, advertising being pretty blatantly purchased, which we saw in the 2016 election as well. So I think the political side of it we'll probably see and hear more about, not because there's nothing happening on the other side, but because these are, perhaps more prominent and more newsworthy. And in some cases, the things that are happening behind the scenes you never hear about because they may not be detected or they may be too sensitive to release to the press.